officers, councillors and members of the public who may be watching this on YouTube. We do seem to be a bit short of members. Another councillor is joining us, so that's good. Anyhow, we will press on, and if there have been difficulties in connecting with us, no doubt that will be resolved and we can expect some late attendees. So we'll skip over apologies for absence at the moment, I think, and move on to point 2 on the agenda, which is declarations of pecuniary interest. Are there any of those, please? No, there are not. Now, I think I would like to change the order of the agenda for this evening. So after we've covered point 3, the minutes of the previous meeting, I'd like to just discuss our status as a group and our working practice going forward. Then we'll go on to the quarter 3 monitoring report, then the apprenticeship levy, and then as the final point of the evening, I'd like to discuss our work at the July meeting and what we might cover at the July meeting in addition to the normal monitoring report. So let us move on to agenda item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Are those meetings accurate and may I sign them? If so, we'll then move on to matters arising. Any questions on the previous minutes? No? Okay, thank you for approving those. Now, moving on to matters arising, I'm on page 1 of the pack. I note that the disability disallowance will be carried forward, having for future consideration and review at another meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission, if we wish to do that. Obviously, at the time, as was explained, that recommendation wasn't, or the referral wasn't carried forward to Cabinet. Good evening, Ed.
Good evening, Stephen. Sorry, we're a bit late. Thank you very much, everybody.
We're just going through the minutes and matters arising. I'm on page 1. Then over to page 2, we have apprenticeships, and that's on the agenda for this evening. We have an action then in the middle of page 2 about Caroline explaining a question of 8.2 million of expenditure, and that's also on the agenda for this evening. At the bottom of page 2, there's the action about the large debt, and again, I'm sure David will update us on that when it comes to that agenda point. I think that covers off the minutes. Any comments, colleagues? No? Okay. So let me move on then to our new point of business, which is the status of this group and our working practices. Now, I think it's fair to say that it's generally accepted that task groups work best when they comprise of people who have an interest in the subject matter. And I think it's also fair to say that task groups working in private and sometimes applying the Chatham House rule find that it helps the free exchange of information and opinions. In addition, a task group that's meeting in private needn't concern itself with political balance or the rules of proportionality, which normally apply in relation to council public meetings. Now, as we can see clearly this evening, this group is dominated by councillors in opposition. In fact, there isn't a Labour councillor here this evening, but be that as it may be, our Labour member may join us later. But the point is really that as we are currently unique, we're neither a standard task group, which comprises of whoever wants to be involved, nor a scrutiny panel, which has a membership which reflects proportionality of councillors on the council. Now, this kind of unique circumstance has been discussed between myself and Peter, Councillor Southgate, as chairman of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission, and we've concluded that the best course of action is for us to continue to meet as like a standard task group. And that would mean that the group would be open to councillors of all political parties in any number, but it would also mean that we would meet in private henceforth. Now, our minutes, of course, would be presented to or received by the Commission. So the outcomes from our discussions would be made public. Also, when a referral is made to the Commission, the chairman of this group would attend in person and present the submission. Up until now, the chairman's only ever made a written submission to the Commission. Thus, taking all these kind of factors into account, it is my intention that this should be the last meeting of this group in public, and that the July meeting and henceforth all subsequent meetings should be in private. Would any colleagues care to comment? Peter.
Yes, if I may, thank you, Chair. If you go back far enough, we had 4 scrutiny panels. One of them was called the Way We Work, which I always liked in terms of that sort of does what it says on the tin. But progressively, as our resources have been reduced, and it was decided the Way We Work panel should go, we then decided to continue. Still supported, but more informally. And at that point, the penny dropped that there are people who are interested in these things, and there are people who are most decidedly not. And the world can be divided, really. And it was far better that people who were keen and interested should be free to join this task group, and it should not be imposed upon those who are not interested, and that is by and large how it's worked. It is, in a sense, neither one thing nor the other, in that we meet in public like a scrutiny panel, and yet we don't impose proportionality on membership. And I'm very keen that we keep it that way for the reasons that Stephen has outlined. So there will still be the ability for minutes to be referenced back to the Commission and taken forward in that way. And whilst it's not ideal that at the moment we only have 1 Labour member, but that that's something that can be, I hope, will redress itself over time. So yes, I think this is a good proposal, that in future we meet in private, and we can carry on very much setting our own agenda and pursuing the topics that we feel are important. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, on the basis that there are no other comments, I think that's agreed, and that is the way we will move forward. So thank you. I think we now just return to the apologies for absence, which I skipped over because of connection difficulties. So all of the members are in fact present now, except for Councillor Henry. So Rosie, perhaps you could just note that for the minutes that Councillor Henry sends apologies.
Chair, sorry,
Right.
Councillor Henry may be joining us late, in fact. Yeah.
Okay, apologies for lateness, please, Rosie. Good, thank you. So now we move on to the meat of the meeting, really, which is the quarterly report. So Caroline, if I may invite you to lead off, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we have a quarter 3, month 9 report, which went to Cabinet earlier this month. And that showed a deterioration in our financial position from what had been reported the previous month, month 8. And so a deterioration in the overspend from 2.8 million to 4.3 million, mainly as a result of the further lockdown, national lockdown, and in particular the impact on our parking income. So that assumes sort of a lockdown position until the year end. So you will see that there was quite a significant swing within environment and regeneration on page 7 from 9.4 million last month to 11.3 million this month. There was a slight deterioration in corporate services as well. But perversely, there was an improvement within children's schools and families and within community and housing. So that's what's quite strange at the moment with some of those areas where there's clearly additional COVID expenditure, but there's been some underlying underspends underneath that. The table that we set out on pages 8 and 9 shows the impact purely of COVID, additional costs that are not fully specifically grant funded. And that also shows an increase from 7.5 million to 9.3 million. We are hopeful that there will be some further grant income to come from the sales fees and charges. However, we have had a query about our second sales fees and charges return, which we're just looking to resolve by the end of this week to hopefully release that grant payment to us. So we're just seeing they want some further information from us to be able to see if we can still get those monies through. There were some capital adjustments as well, which were set out in the summary and later on in section 4 of the report. Mainly sort of movements around slippage moving into future years, because we're trying to encourage budget managers at this late stage of the financial year to have a better view of their capital spend, and if they're not going to spend it, either release it completely or slip into future years, and then the knock-on impact of the future years programme to look at further again. And you can see, and that also then feeds into the capital strategy and capital programme, which went to January Cabinet and will be coming again on the 22nd as part of the final budget report. We have progress on the savings, so there's been sort of some limited progress on the savings, and then we have the debt report as well, set out as an appendix for you, which has shown a deterioration in our overall debt outstanding, in particular with regards to SIL levies. And I suppose pleased to say, I think some of the legal contributions from our boroughs in the partnership, they are certainly been chasing them to make sure they pay, and I think they have paid. Some of them have paid by now, but David will be able to confirm if that is the case or not. We also have some of the information around the STAP control to give you some information on the numbers of permanent staff and agency workers. There has been an increase in agency workers in some areas purely because of the COVID response, in particular the track and trace within environment and regeneration, doing the contact tracing for cases that have deemed positive for a COVID test. But quite happy to take questions, Chair, if you want to go through on a sort of a section by section basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. We have, I think, an established way of working through the report section by section, so I will guide us through that. I see that Councillor McGrath has raised his hand. Simon, would you like to say something?
I just had a question. I don't know, it's on page 8. I don't know whether this is the right place to ask it, so apologies if it isn't.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to questions now, and we want to start really with the first section, which is the overview. So yes, Simon, please ask your question.
Well, I think I've got two actually. The first one is you talk about the money for that the new government scheme for lost income, that we've taken into account, I think 6.97 million, but we haven't yet taken into account the rest. Do we have any idea how much we'll claim for the rest of that income? I mean, approximately. And secondly, on our estimates for parking income, when do we assume that it starts to get back to normal? I mean, what are the assumptions about lockdown in the parking income assumptions? Thanks.
So we don't currently have an estimate of the third grant claim for sales fees and charges, because the impact of lockdown has further impacted on our income, and we need to understand that a bit more. So we'll be doing that grant claim in April. So we will accrue for it within our final year-end accounts, but we don't know at this stage. As I said, the parking income assumes the lockdown continues until the end of the financial year.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Councillor Bembo and then Councillor Southgate. Nigel. You have to unmute, Nigel.
Thank you, Chair. Right, I would like to ask some quick questions about the sources, and that's on page 12 and 13. I understand the services have been with some help for 6 months, but business rates, cancel checks, and etc. There've been a lot of trying to repeat the payment. However, on the top of the page is mentioned that 129,000 have been put for the head of recovery. Is very little detail what the head of recovery do. Is it possible? Can you explain more? And what does the head of the recovery do? And I know he or she is a short-term appointment. Is that for a year or whatever? Thank you.
So I think as well, around sort of June, July time, when we thought we were coming out of the initial stage of COVID and initial lockdown, we were working towards what we thought the recovery position might be. And we did have our Merton Improvement Board, which was also looking at transformation, and we felt it was ideal to actually combine transformation and the recovery together. The Chief Exec thought it would be useful to have an interim head of recovery to help us kickstart that process because of all the work that was still going on, responding to COVID, doing business as usual, trying to deliver savings. So thought having someone in to help drive that forward would be useful. The contract is currently, I think, up until the end of May this year. So a further few months into the new financial year, but that is at the current position.
Okay, and does this person also help with the local business?
Does it help with local? No.
No.
So
it just work just at the council.
Just for the council. So, but we're helping also with the Merton the Place story as well. So, but not directly helping the businesses. Sarah Xavier and James McGinley's team are helping more on that side, other than the business grants that we are paying out still.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Nigel. Peter, your question.
Yes, just following up on Simon's question there, and just seeing if we can't perhaps put it within some parameters. I mean, we have an idea perhaps of what the maximum amount we might be claiming. Can we say that we're looking at a sum between, just for sake of putting a figure to it, between 3 and 5 million, between 5 and 8 million? What can we scale it?
I think between 2 and 5 million.
All right. Thank you.
So I think that leaves us nicely balanced, doesn't it, for year-end loss, possible small year-end loss, or possible small year-end profit. I quite like that as an answer.
Good.
Councillor Gretton. Your question, please. Ed. You have to unmute yourself, Ed.
I haven't started speaking yet, Stephen, but thank you very much for the reminder. Just a quick question, just a quick clarification. The second tranche of the 75p in the pound, just the period that covers, does that go up to, Karen, does that go up to the end of November? Is that right? So or is it further into December, the second tranche, which we've already included?
I think it's September to November.
Yeah, okay. So
August,
yeah, so
August to November.
Yeah, so the new claim is from 1 December. Okay, and just I guess the big question is what we've got in front of us for end December shows the movement from 2.8 million as of end forecast as of end November to sort of an adjusted 4.3 million. But when you look, so got that fine, but then when you look at the other papers that are in the various scrutiny panels at the moment, what they seem to add in that I don't think this one doesn't yet, but they kind of add in the favourable adjustment on the, is that right, on the council tax collection fund? So there's, I think, I can't remember what it is, it's nearly 4 million anyway. But is that right? The council tax collection fund is a favourable movement, is apparent in the other papers, but hasn't yet been set out in this forecast. Is that right? I think it is.
So what we show for the monitoring papers is the loss in year to Merton of the council tax and the business rates. What we have shown in the budget papers is the collection fund loss, and there has been a deterioration in the collection fund because of the additional bad debts and appeals provision. But we can spread that loss for 2021 only over 3 years. So that's what we showed in January, and there will be a final position after what we call the business rates return back to MHCRG at the end of January.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Kohler, Paul, your questions.
Caroline, perhaps you could explain to Councillor Gretton that figure is not money coming in. It's simply a way of accounting for the fact there's an underspend. That's correct. There's an under recovery. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
I hope that's clear, Ed.
Oh, thank you very much for pointing that out, Paul. Yeah, what I've been tracking is the collection fund forecast has changed very considerably over the last few months, and it's overall it's been a very I think when the council went out and set out these very adverse numbers back last summer, it turned out in the months that followed there's an adjustment of several million. But since then, of course, normally you have to account for that in the immediately following budget year in full, but now it's spread over 3 years. So the effect of that, Paul, is to have sort of a less adverse impact on the annual budget on the general fund. You also may be interested, the 75p in the pound, Paul, which you've heard about for income losses. You see there's another funding as well for council tax losses as well, which I think for the new financial year as well. So that's another adjustment which I guess we'll see at some stage in the new financial year budget numbers as well.
Sorry, Councillor Gretton, if I could just clarify, what we've been reporting through the monitoring is the shortfall on council tax and business rates collection. It is not the collection fund position. That's what we report in the January and the February cabinet papers, which is why there is a difference, because the collection fund picks up the overall deficit position and includes the losses for provisions for bad debts and appeals.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Thanks.
Councillor Bembo, do you have another question you'd like to ask, Nigel? No, you need to unmute, Nigel. Nigel?
So, okay, thank you. I would like to talk about further on our page 18 about
Nigel, can I just stop you there, because
Yeah.
I think we want to go through the papers in order, otherwise we'll be
Oh,
jumping about too much.
yes,
So
yes, that's
we'll
fine,
come
yeah,
on to page 18 shortly, maybe in the next item or so.
okay.
Just in terms of the overview, trying to avoid putting words into Caroline's mouth, but I think the overview is that depending on how revenue claims are confirmed, the council may be heading to a small profit for this year, but if income is not confirmed as hoped, we may be heading for a slightly larger but still relatively small loss. Is that a fair summary, Caroline?
So in the January Cabinet report, which was based on month 8 monitoring, we did say, because you account differently, as Councillor Breton has pointed out, differently for the council tax and business rate losses, we did think that there could be an overall surplus, and therefore we took some monies into the budget for 21-22 as a result. However, as the position has got slightly worse, we're having to reverse some of that benefit in the February report. But we think there should be a favourable outturn.
Thank you. So let us, having dealt with the overview, let us move on to the departmental reports, if we may. So I think that starts with corporate services on page 10. Are there any questions that people would like to ask in relation to the information on corporate services? Ed, and then Paul.
If anybody else wants to go first, go ahead. But one question I've got, Carol, do you explain something more about the housing benefit rent allowances overpayments? It seems there's £1 million adverse there in terms of impact on corporate services for this financial year, but we never really discussed that, I don't think, in any of the scrutiny panels that I can remember discussing, or indeed in this financial monitoring task group. And that seems to be, could you say something about how that arises? Is that some overpayment of housing benefit, and then there's been assumptions of subsidy and this sort of thing which have turned out they need to be revisited? So what's driving the overpayments in the first place, and is there anything you think can be done to actually better control that, if that is indeed the cause of the overpayments? Thank you.
So clearly we have housing benefit service, and we have a claim that we prepare each year for the DWP, which is audited. We have over 60,000 claims, 20,000 claims, and over £80 million. People's circumstances change on a regular basis. Sometimes those circumstances are told to us, sometimes we find them out. And as the circumstances change, then it may create an overpayment. Depending on how the overpayment is created, we may get subsidy on it, or we may not get subsidy on it. And there's a threshold that allows you to get some subsidy on the overpayments up to a certain amount. And if you exceed that amount, then you don't get any subsidy for those overpayments. So it's trying to mitigate the impact where we can of overpayments and errors, but some cases in particular for self-employed individuals can be quite complex, and the auditors will go through cases of up to 40 to go through and then do extrapolations. So depending on the grant claim and the extrapolations, we can lose benefit subsidy on the claim of about 80 million. So we're still finalising our 18-19 grant claim. And indeed, we have had some discussions at this task group here, and we also have had discussions at the Standards and General Purposes Committee meeting, because normally there is a separate audit and a separate fee done for the housing benefit grant claims.
Thank you. Paul and then Simon, please.
Thanks. I had a couple of substantive questions, but Simon, I think, is going to ask those. So can I just ask a general point as I was going forward? I accept it's a bit late in the day, but it's very useful with the summary, where we separate COVID and non-COVID. In the actual detailed narrative, sometimes you get a bit of separation like you do in the overview here for corporate. You don't get it in the next overview for children's schools. Would it be possible in the next report to separate in the narrative the COVID from the non-COVID? Because I spend my time looking for where the non-COVID losses are. They're often hidden in text about both. Would that be difficult for the next time?
We'll certainly look to see if we can include some information about that, but it may not be the full extent, and there's only one more month to come for this next year, but we'll look to see what we can do.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Simon? And then Ed.
Thanks. My question is about, it's on page 11, and it's the £199,000 adverse variance due to the use of agency staff covering the head of communications post. That seems like an awful lot of money to be paying for agency staff. How long is that for, and why is it such a large amount of money?
That's been there for the year, and the report, which is going to Standards and General Purposes Committee, highlights the agency staff over £30 an hour and the length of time that they've been here. Originally brought in just at the start of the pandemic, so we did recognise that we needed an experienced comms person to help us both with our internal comms, and as you would have seen with our external comms. There's been a great call on the comms team to actually help with the response and getting the residents and businesses to understand the position and how we can help them and how they can also stay safe. We are looking at a restructure in this area, which is why we have not gone out to recruitment, but we are looking to bring forward a mini restructure within corporate services, and then we will look to finalise the positions there.
Thank you.
Ed.
Thank you, Steve. Just a really quick point of clarification, Karen, if I may, on the housing benefit. Do you happen to know what proportion of the overpayment might have been paid directly to landlords as opposed to recipients of housing benefit? Or is it none of it, or some of it, but we just don't have the numbers to hand? I'm not sure.
Luckily, I can pass that one directly to David Kepler.
Yeah, Councillor. The majority of overpayments are paid to landlords. We are encouraged to pay landlords as much as we can on housing benefits. Just one thing that I talk, so the majority is probably to landlords, although then what we often find is they say they were unaware of the change of circumstances, and then we end up having to try to pursue it from the claimant. Just to give a very quick bit of context on the overpayments, I think we just finished, as Caroline says, we're finishing 18-19. I think the total overpayment figure was in the region of £2 to £3 million. Only 250 of that, so 250 of that related to what we would classify as local authority error. So where we've either made mistakes on claims or where there's been a backlog that's caused that delay. So the majority of overpayments we classify as claimant error, where they fail to tell us of change in circumstances.
Okay, thank you, David. I think time to move on to the next section, which is environment and regeneration, starting on page 14. Do colleagues have questions about environment and regeneration? Nigel, did you have a question on page 18?
Sorry. Yes, I do. It is about future motion. It is I struggle to understand why there was no budget available or planned for, for the repayment to the Richmond Bridge, because Richmond Bridge have been left closed for almost 2 years this spring or summer. Therefore, why wasn't any plan plan ahead a year later, or for the bridge work done? Thank you.
So I think this is purely the revenue costs associated with the bridge. Clearly, there is a capital budget for the replacement of the bridge, but it took us a while to actually get to the position where we were able to let a contract. So this was all the worker staff dealing with Environment Agency, dealing with claims, dealing with insurance, and pursuing to see if there was any faults. So it's that part for which there was no budget put forward or growth required or asked for when we set the budget, but certainly there is the budget in the capital programme for the replacement of the bridge.
Okay, which do you have the resources to cover for the new bridge in place?
So as the bridge is in the capital programme, it is resourced, and indeed we got some additional funding for it from TfL.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the next section is children, schools and families. That starts
Councillor
on
Kohler, I think, had a
page
question.
19. And of course,
I have a question, please, Stephen. So I'm waving here.
Councillor Kohler.
Yes. Sorry, of course you can, Paul.
Sorry, I should use that, shouldn't I?
Fine.
Sorry. Hi, so it's just on GLL, Caroline. I see there's sort of 830k we're sort of foregoing in what profit share, I assume. What money have we put into GLL now, actually hard cash, as well as money we've foregone?
We're on our third tranche of support for them. I haven't got that information to hand, but we can get that for you and send out with the minutes.
Yeah, it just does concern me. Are they almost too big to fail, and therefore we're all propping them up when perhaps the cruel kindness would have been we simply put our leisure and culture leisure centres into mothballs and open them up at the end of the pandemic? Have we ever gone through that thought process of, is this the right way to spend a lot of money?
We have gone through that thought process, and indeed all the London boroughs who have Greenwich Leisure as their provider have worked together to make sure that we're not being played off one against the other. So even mothballing, there is a cost involved in that, because in some ways we want them to be there when we come out of the pandemic, because health is clearly a vital factor in recovery from COVID, no pun intended. But we do actually want to ensure that they are sustainable, which is why working closely, and Chris Lee has been leading on that cross-London working group to make sure that we are proportionate in the monies that we do give them.
Would it be possible to give me the figures? Not now, but later. Thank you.
Ed, do you have a question?
Yeah, just in terms of picking up on the waste expenditure, I think there's an adverse variance there of well, it was about 500k, 582k. Just in terms of, I appreciate in in the context of the pandemic, people may be a bit more reluctant to look at the contract and make sure that things are being performed, the correct sort of standards are being delivered in terms of performance. But is the council still monitoring the performance of street cleaning and things like that? And to the extent there are penalty provisions and the contract where the bins are not being emptied or the streets are not being swept or the leaves are not being cleaned and things like that, are those things still being looked at by the council? Is the council actually monitoring the performance of the contractor at all?
Almost certainly, yes, Councillor Gresham, because we are very clear that there has been no detrimental effect on the service. The level of service there hasn't been an impact on the staffing of the service for us. So there is very clear monitoring going on, and it's mainly sort of some of the issues around, as people are at home more, there's less commercial waste being collected for which we charge fees, and more residential waste which is sort of necessarily going to landfill, which costs us more. So it's those dynamics as well. But yes, there is still significant monitoring going on of the contract.
Thank you, Caroline. So I think we're now perhaps ready to move on to children, schools and families, which starts on page 19. Do colleagues have questions about that? No. Peter, Councillor Southgate.
Yes, thank you. Just linking this to the proposed savings that we put massive growth into children's schools and families, as I recall 2-3 years ago, and we're now seemingly anticipating a favourable variance, and we've decided that some 200,000 of that can be counted as a saving to be taken into the budget. So broadly, have I got the picture right? We've as things are panning out, they didn't actually need all of the growth that we provided.
It could be seen to be that way, or they've amended their services so they don't need that level of growth. But it is looking, so some of that was around the PFI where they've additional pupil numbers, so therefore we got additional grant. But in other areas, it does appear that they may not need the level of growth that was given to them initially.
Ed.
Just a question, that's a good point actually, on the PFI. I appreciate PFI setup requires payment to specific contractors and their arrangements for school maintenance service and things like that. But I know we mentioned the performance of the council in terms of how it monitors street cleaning contracts and things like that. But to what extent does the council get involved at all in actually monitoring delivery standards when it comes to schools maintenance? Because I appreciate you were obligated to continue the PFI contract for a number of years more further. But is there sort of a monitoring of the standards that the schools should be getting under those contracts, and is that monitored and to make sure that the contractual standards are being delivered for the schools? So
there is a specific member of staff whose task is to monitor that contract, liaise closely with the schools and make sure that the main contractor is following up on their responsibilities. We do have a slight issue with the subcontractor at this stage, but we're doing some work with the main contractor to address that.
Thank you, Caroline.
I have a question myself about the dedicated school grant. We referred us at the last meeting to what was going to go into the cabinet papers in January. I've had a good look at them, and I think I understand it a bit better, but I'm also now a bit more concerned, because if I've understood the cabinet papers correctly, at the end of this financial year, the deficit will be 28 million, and at the end of the next financial year, the deficit will be 47 million. But whatever, they're big numbers. I'm still not quite understanding how the thing is going to unravel, because it seems to me that at some stage in the future, either central government gives us the money, or we have to effectively write this amount off. Can you just help me understand it a bit better, please?
So there is a working group set up with Hannah Doody and myself, and then Roger, Elle and Jane, looking at this area and what can be done to get underneath why are we so out of kilter compared to our neighbours, because as you say, they're quite scary numbers, and they only ever appear to go one way. So we're hopeful with that group that's been set up that will do some work to understand, and as we sort of returned it within the meeting, to start to get that oil tanker to turn. But I think it will take some time. And sort of, I know Councillor Gresham refers to, we have the 3-year statutory override, but even at the end of the 3 years, our deficit is still going to be sort of 69 million. So if we don't do something, we're going to have quite a significant deficit position that we may have to pick up unless there is a significant increase in funding. The DfE do not give any indication that they're going to change the way, the basis of funding, because there are some authorities that are still in surplus. Majority of London boroughs are in deficit, but not necessarily to the extent that we are.
Okay. I think Paul, then Simon, then Ed again.
Thanks, Caroline. I was always under the impression everyone was suffering, it was across London. Now you're saying us being out of kilter and some even being in surplus. Can we drill down a bit more? Because I didn't realise that. I thought this was something everyone was suffering the same with.
Suffering the same. So there's been a few boroughs in London that have had deficits for a number of years. However, their in-year deficit is not the scale of ours. So that's where we're out of kilter, is the size of our in-year deficit. And that's what we are looking to do some urgent work about that and to take that forward.
And we have no intimation why that's the case at the moment.
Well, we have high numbers of education, health and social care plans, but we don't fully understand why we have a high number of education, health and social care plans. We don't appear to have an appeals issue. So there's a number of some number of cases which go to appeal. We don't seem to be out of kilter with the numbers that we lose, but it's just the significant number coming forward. So that's what we still need to do some further work on. And then how we maximise the use of our ordinary schools before then our special schools, before then relying on sort of expensive residential placements, particularly for the high needs. So that's the work we're doing more of, but it takes time.
Thank you.
Simon, Ed, and then Nigel.
It seems to me that there are two issues. The first one is why our ongoing situation each year is different to some other boroughs, and that sounds like we're looking at. But the other one is, and I know we've discussed this before, but I'm afraid I simply don't understand it, why this isn't much more of a problem than it seems to be. Why isn't these enormous deficits, where we're spending more than we're getting in, raising much more of an alarm than they are? Because it absolutely dwarfs the figures that we're talking about elsewhere. So I don't understand why this isn't such a big issue, and why in a couple of years' time, when we're facing, I think you said £60 million, we're not going to be in a catastrophic Croydon type situation.
So I would say we are making a big issue of it. It's on our risk register. It features highly within our monitoring report. It features within our medium-term financial strategy, and features within the external auditors report. So it does, I would say, feature quite hard and quite high on people's agenda. I think there's a feeling that for some it's an accounting issue, therefore it can be tackled in that way. So we have set some monies aside, but we cannot fund the DSG itself with monies from the general fund. So we have a reserve at this stage because we just need to see how the government would treat it. So we are doing work on it. We are clear, and we have discussions at the Standards and General Purposes Committee when we have the outturn report, and the external auditor has signed off and are comfortable with our approach to the way that we are dealing with the DSG deficit. But that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily happy with the size of the DSG deficit, and that's why working with Hannah, we're hopeful that we can start to turn this tanker around, because it is not sustainable in the long term. Because if this deficit continues to increase, it will eventually dwarf our net budget, and that cannot be right.
I'm sorry, this is a stupid question, but where does the money to fund the deficit come from? If by a deficit, I'm assuming that we mean that the income we're getting for this area is less than the money we're spending. Where does the difference come from to fund that gap?
So in accounting terms, we borrow it from next year's amount of grant. In simple terms, we're funding it from our cash reserves in the short term.
Why doesn't that deficit, so when we discussed earlier the situation for the year, when it, and it looks like we're 4 or 5 million deficit, but maybe we'll be more or less even. Where does the DSG deficit come in relation to that deficit?
It doesn't show there because of how we account for it. However, we have less cash balances, therefore less interest on those cash balances. And therefore, when we get to the corporate items, we're not getting much interest on our cash balances anyway. But that's where that impact would show.
But eventually, we'll use up all the cash balances. Because I'm assuming the cash balances are the difference between when we get the money in from the various sources and when we have to pay it out.
Yes, but I'm hopeful by that time we will have addressed that. We have or we can borrow internally, not borrow internally, we can borrow. So we can't go below £10 million in cash balances.
But we can go and borrow, but there has to be at some point we have to pay back. Are we saying if we're 20 million in deficit this year, at some point we have to pay back that 20 million, unless the government gives it to us? And paying it back means less money to spend on other things in Merton.
At the moment, we cannot use our monies to pay it off. So that's why we've got the 3-year statutory override.
By law?
Yes. But we are setting monies aside in the event that it comes to the end of that statutory override, and we don't know quite what the government may do at that stage.
Or are we setting aside the amount of the deficit?
No, we are setting aside 100% of the deficit up till the end of this financial year, and then 50% of the ongoing deficit.
So if the deficit up to this financial year is X million, somewhere there's a pot of money with X million on it.
Correct. And that's
and where does that money come from?
During last year's budget process, we set out increases to what we call the spending review reserve. And during the process of this year, we have been topping that up. And indeed, within the January Cabinet report, there was entries there which showed how we've adjusted for the increase in the deficit, and therefore what additional monies we needed to set aside. So
I see. So if the government allowed us to, we could say we've got that money to pay off that £20 million. We can pay it off. It's just at the moment we're not allowed to do it.
Correct.
Okay. And thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, have we had? I mean, you're probably going to say we have, so my apologies, but have we had a paper that explains how this works?
There was a paper to Cabinet January 19.
Okay, I'll have a look for that. Thank you.
I think it's Ed, then Nigel, then Peter, please.
Yeah, I think yeah, I kind of this is a really important issue, as Councillor McGrath says, and I really just throw this out to other members, because in our role as sort of on the financial monitoring task group and scrutiny, so as it's causing this big deficit, which is kind of held outside of the revenue fund for now, and it's a big deficit which we haven't actually got an answer to yet in the midterm as to how it's going to be addressed, and we know that the council is taking some steps to build its own in-house capacity. But what we've never seen in any of the scrutiny panels, and I don't know if other members are interested in calling for this, but I'd find it very useful to set out, here is the capacity which the borough has at the moment, and there's the delta, which is that people getting the private placement, independent placement, which is costing a lot more, and with the recent expansion in councils in borough capacity, how much of the deficit, if you like, the recurring annual deficit, is likely to be addressed is going to be addressed by the recent investments in the additional capacity. But I know the spending review before Christmas, there was an additional fund as well, which sort of set out Merson's going to get some of that or apply for it. I'm not quite sure how it works, but there's an extra pot there. So if Merton makes full use of that funding or applies for it, whichever it is, how much of the beyond the recent capacity which is being built for the schools, how much from the extra spending review money of the annual deficit is going to be, or when you model it, is going to be addressed and therefore reduced by the extra spending review funding for new capacity. And to the extent there's still a gap in the annual, is there still a gap? How big is it? What proportion of the annual gap? And how can the council do more to address that final gap, if you like? Can the council invest its own capital, or what's the potential sources of funds? And I just think it's such a big issue. I'd personally find it very helpful to see in the midterm how we're actually, and put it before scrutiny, how the council might be using some of its recent expansion or the additional funds before Christmas, or what's the gap then needed, so we can actually see it, and what steps can the council take to try and raise that funding to actually address the gap. I don't know what other members think about that, but I'd certainly see that as a very helpful paper that could come before scrutiny at some stage, whether it's this panel or OSC or indeed Children, Schools and Families.
Maybe we're staying into the topic of what we discussed in July. So maybe at the end of the meeting, when we come to discuss July's activities and subsequent meetings too, I suppose, and pick that up then. Don't know if you want to add anything, Caroline.
So certainly within the report which came to Cabinet, which I'm just trying to find, there was the update, the action plan, what we're looking to do, how we're expanding our special schools, how we're increasing capacity within our ordinary schools to reduce the further increase on the DSG. But the DSG at that time was still increasing, but it was just we weren't increasing as much. So therefore, this investment was being made. And I thought that the paper did go on to Children and Young People Scrutiny Panel. So I suppose with the work that we're looking to do at the moment with Hannah, is whether we're going to have some of that information by July. So that's what I'm just struggling with, or whether it would be better going back to the Children and Young People's Panel when we do have something more concrete to be able to tell you, because at the moment it's still going up, which isn't really of much help to you.
Let's park that for the moment. Nigel, then Peter, please. Nigel? I think you need to unmute, Nigel.
So, did you know it was me? Sorry about that. All right, it's not mentioned in there, and already council have been pushing out school on the street scheme, which was since last September. Is it possible? Can you tell us where are we on this, and have funding been started, you know, to you know, through the fine system? And the other question is, because I'm very concerned about a certain school in my ward, which is the new school has just been built, but there's no safety measures in place. Therefore, this brings me to the question: have there been any other grants being you know, applied for, or in our chance, you know, working with TFO or whoever to ensure this new school got safety measures, you know, in place, and also along with trees and etc. Thank you.
So if that's the school streets schemes you're asking about, Nigel,
Yeah.
we are looking at, we got some capital grant funding, and we're using SIL, strategic SIL monies to fund the works that are going to go on in those areas, and those will be implemented shortly. You asked about, was it trees? I don't have any.
And we have you also applied any other grants, not just school streets scheme, but in our chance, because these are new school just been built in my ward, Abbey ward, on High Path, but it got no safety measures in place, and it's next to a Jewish carriageway, which is the most dangerous, you know, bad quality where children breathe in, and etc. This is what I am talking about, and I'm wondering, have you applied any other grants or?
I don't know. So we'd have to ask Environment and Regeneration to come back to you on that.
Okay. Therefore, nothing has been done.
That's not what I said, Nigel. I said I'd ask E&R to come back to you.
I see. Because this school has been built since, you know, two years ago, and there's no excuses. You know, you need to put the children safety in place first, and I've not seen any of it.
I think, Nigel, the issue about applying additional funds for your school is perhaps best answered by Caroline or someone on her staff send you an email explaining what funds have been applied for, and that might help you understand what's happened there, or indeed maybe not happened. But I think that might be useful to you. Peter, your question?
Yes, thank you. Still back on DSG, and actually on page 24, it does partly answer Ed's question there, because it points out that the number of EHCPs awarded is going up by, on a quick calculation, a bit more than 10% per annum, from 2032 to 2,262. And that rate of increase exceeds the rate at which we're managing to create new school places. So that of itself is interesting. Why not only have we got a lot of these things, but they are also growing at quite a rate, and whether that compares again with other boroughs might be worth looking at. I had a question though, really, if I may. there's reference to a report that went to, did that go to the DFE a year ago on covering the recovery? I'm really looking for what's the, what are the signals coming out of the DFE on all this, if you try to read the entrails, and is there any intimation at all that they are going to address this, and if so, how?
Well, they came to see us in 2020. We were and we were meant to have had a follow-up meeting, we thought November last year. I think COVID has had an impact on that, so they only went out to see 7 schools to look at what they were doing, and they were schools that authorities that had deficits for a number of years. So
Okay.
we weren't necessarily, whilst we're on their radar, we weren't to the extent of some other boroughs. So that's why I think we have been pushing for additional funding, because we're trying to highlight that there are authorities with more deficits, just not the scale of our in-year deficit compared to others.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we move on to the next section, which is community and housing. And that starts on page 26. Any questions in relation to community and housing report? Councillor Kohler, Paul.
So I tried to get my head round the graph on page 28 and I just couldn't. What is the y-axis?
That's the gross cost of placements that we pay out.
42 million.
Yeah.
Really is that much? My goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I assumed it was less than that.
That would be across older people, learning disabilities and mental health.
Anyone else? Simon.
Thank you. Where is the money that we pay to TfL for travel cards for senior citizens? Which item is that in? Because presumably that's gone down as you know, people haven't been able to use TfL.
It's within adult social care, but it's going down from 21-22, not this year. And we've reflected that in the budget forecast to January Cabinet.
So you mean that although it happened this year, they're reducing it for next year?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank
It
you.
will reduce actually for the next 2 years, because it's done on sort of a lag basis.
Approximately how much is that?
Come down about 1.5, I think, million.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So year in arrears, effectively. So shall we move on to the capital programme, which is on page 34? Any questions about capital matters? No, okay. On page 37, we start the report on savings. Now, obviously, a lot of work's already been done on savings at the various scrutiny panels. But if people have additional questions they would like to ask about the savings schedules, now is the time, please. Ed.
Sorry, what page is the savings shown for this current financial year in terms of progress? So I'm just trying to find it. Is that page 37, is it?
Yeah, I think it starts on page 37. Or
Yeah.
39, really. Yeah.
Karen, yeah, okay. So is there any update, Karen, beyond this? I guess we projected we had there was some target savings for this year. I guess which is probably less the focus of the current rounds of the scrutiny panels, but in terms of the savings for this year, I think we're about 5 or 6 million behind or something. Yeah, is that expected to sort of remain as is for the in terms of the final year numbers, or do you think people will be making any of those savings back, or is that do you expect that to be fairly accurate in terms of the savings shortfall for this financial year?
I think there'll be minimal movement now this financial year.
Okay, thank you.
I think the next section really is the debt section, which starts on page 71. David, I expect you'll want to introduce this and also perhaps mention the very large debt we've discussed in the past, remembering always that we're in the public meeting and the matters of commercial confidentiality maybe need to be considered. David.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So so we're on page 71. So just a very quick overview. Sundry debt over 30 days has increased by just over 2 million since I last reported at the end of September. Largest increase is again SIL, and referring to that case, Councillor, now that I've been talking about the last couple of meetings. I've had further discussions with Tim Cantley, who's responsible for the SIL team and also legal. And I think what we're looking at is perhaps an overview of the way that we collect the SIL debt to get the SIL team involved at an earlier stage in the process and to get them involved more in the decision making on what actual recovery action we take. So they have a better knowledge than just a sundry debt team whose options are limited with going to the debtor and going to legal. They want to try and look at it slightly wider and look at other options that are available with those developers and perhaps other developments that they're going on. So the case that we've referred to previously, the £800,000 case, the review that we agreed with the company through our legal section is due to end at the end of February, and they are due to come back with a proposal on repayment in early March. And at that stage, Tim wants to be involved. So hopefully in future we can report a slightly different approach to trying to collect the SIL debts and make it slightly more effective. Just a couple of other things that I thought I'd mention. Page 72, I give a bit of detail on council tax. Council tax collection for the year, we're just about 2% down on collection as we were in the same period for last year. We did have a remote liability order hearing in December, so we were one of the first London boroughs to have one. It was relatively successful. I guess on the downside, the courts haven't issued us with any further dates. The court service are being reluctant to issue further liability order dates. So as an example, we probably have liability order hearings every month throughout the year. This year we've had one, and the way it's looking, I don't think we'll get another one, certainly within this financial year. So that impacts on our ability to collect some of the council tax debts from our residents who don't pay at the bill or reminder stage. I think, as it's reported earlier on in the outturn report, the actual cost of the deficit for Merton is 2.24 million on that shortfall. Business rates, similar picture. We haven't had any liability order hearings at all. We've undertaken limited recovery. We've tried to be selective. When I look at a list of those companies that owe us money, clearly some of them have struggled and will struggle to pay us, and we're trying to take a considerate approach with them. There are other companies on the list that should have paid the council their business rates. I saw one £150,000 from a company, a supermarket company, so owing us debt. So we're trying to get the balance between pursuing those that should be paying, bearing in mind that we can't take any of them to court at the minute, and trying to take that more conciliatory approach to some of the businesses that are struggling. Just moving on quickly, the enforcement service, the bailiff team is back out working. They started in October and November. It's enforcement by social distancing, so we're not going into houses, we're not undertaking removals. So again, these things all impact on our ability to collect some of the debt. And then just finally, the table on page 75, the overall debt position, so that's includes all debt, council tax, parking, all sundry debt, 39.4 million. The best comparator is probably going back to December 19, where it's 32.8 million. So a £6 million increase in the year. Chair, happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, David. We lost you for a bit there, but
Did you? Oh, sorry, you should have said.
Well, it's fine. I think we got the message that there are a number of special circumstances and special judgments being made. So I think we understand where we are.
Sorry about that.
Won't get you to tell everything again from the day you were born. Peter, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Although first, can I say I think it's remarkable that we are indeed only 2% down on council tax collection and something of an achievement. My question though relates to debts on SIL and the fact that SIL was meant to supersede Section 106 precisely because it was tariff based and there shouldn't be so much room for argy-bargy about the amount to be paid. So it's not in practice working out like that.
I think one thing that slightly skews the figures often is the way I report sundry debt is once the invoice is raised. So if the invoice is raised today, as far as my reporting is concerned, in 30 days' time, it's then 30 days old and it falls into one of them columns there. The reality with some of the SIL debt is they'll raise the invoice today and it won't actually be due for possibly 3 or 6 months. So we're reporting a debt that isn't actually due. That said, where I know that's happened, I try to flag that out. And I think my last report detailed that a little bit more. And as I said, as much as we certainly pursue businesses that owe us the SIL money, I think we've agreed with Tim that we are we are reviewing the way that we collect that debt, and we're going to sort of make it slightly more joined up with the SIL team. I think they're better equipped and they have those relationships with the businesses better than my team do.
Paul.
Thank you, David. Yes. On business rates, while there are, as you and I know, we all know, many businesses that cannot pay because of the trouble they're in post-COVID or during COVID. Those that can pay, there's absolutely no excuse. Are we I know you can't take them to court now, I realise that, but are we being as heavy as we can? Can we charge interest on this debt?
No, we can't charge interest. So really the options are you issue the bill, it's a reminder, and then a final notice, and then they're the statutory documents, and then it's applying to the magistrate's court for a liability order. That then gives you the powers to either instruct a bailiff, maybe look at bankruptcy or something like that. Without that liability order, we are limited. And whilst I think, and I had this discussion with Caroline, I think whilst we could, and it would normally liability order hearings, it's sort of bulk hearings. For council tax, there might be 2,000 residents with summons. Business rates, it might be 400 or 500. I said to Caroline, if the courts do agree to let us take businesses to court, we would do it in a slightly different way where we would do it manually. So we check every single case, do they fit in the camp where we think they should be paying, or do they fit in the camp where where we're not expecting them to pay, and go down that route. Take us longer, councillor, but we would do that. But the courts aren't entertaining liability order hearings for businesses. I mean, they're not, as I said earlier, they're not really entertaining or they're not really entertaining hearings for anything at the minute.
And those private law rights to add interest to debt just don't apply to us, is that right?
No, not for council tax or business rates.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So I've just had a message from Ed. Caroline, are you about to leave or something? I mean, leave the meeting?
Who, me?
No,
Oh,
Caroline.
sorry.
No,
No, so
unless someone's chucking me out. No.
we don't do a Jackie Weaver. Ed, was there something you wanted to ask? Because I think I've misunderstood your message.
No, I was just saying if there's a time just at the end, then all the individual departments and annexes, if there was time, I had just one general question, but I just wanted to ask when the right time to ask that is, yeah.
Okay, well, let's finish off our conversation with David, and then you can ask your question before we move on to headcount. Okay, sorry about that, just confusing myself here. Don't like this chat function. But any other questions to David, please, colleagues? No, okay, right. Ed, ask your question, please.
Really quick, Karen. So it's more the general one. So that's why I just wanted Stephen's permission. Just said when the best time to ask it was. Just in terms of the council's general, the direct expenditure on matters relating to COVID. Sorry, I should have asked this in the earlier section of the papers. I guess it's page 9, and I do appreciate the pitch is a more complex one because impact on parking revenues and savings which haven't been delivered as well and that type of thing. But just in terms of a direct spending by Merton Council on matters relating to COVID, there's a figure in there of 8.4 million. Is that what it? I guess there's other spending as well which council has incurred, but probably covered by the various ring fence grants. But in terms of direct COVID expenditure, is that what that number represents for the full financial year?
Yes.
I thought it did. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I think the next section in the report is headcount, which starts on page 77 with some tables and continues on from there. Is someone going to say anything about that headcount section?
That would be me, Chair, but I suppose hopefully it is clear what the report says, and I'm not sure it needs much introduction, but happy to take any questions on it. I suppose just as I said at the very beginning, there is an increase COVID marshals and track and trace team to assist with our response to the coronavirus. But happy to take any questions, Chair.
I think the report is clear enough. I have one question myself, which is still slightly bothering me about vacancies. Am I right in interpreting the table on page 77 to mean that in the period since June 2018 to date, we run at roughly 200 vacancies, despite the fact we've got temps and so on, and that's about 10% of our workforce. So kind of my question is that, am I understanding that correctly? And if we are constantly running at 10% less than budget, I'm kind of assuming that we've got a favourable variance on our payroll costs of 10%. Is that fair?
We will have a variance on our payroll costs, but not necessarily to that level, because sometimes the cost of agency staff are higher. So that will, and I was just trying to see if we had overall employee data. So it's not necessarily fully offset. And some areas will keep vacancies. So you've seen within CSF in particular, they are holding non-CSF, non-social care vacancies for a period of time, just to resolve issues. And indeed, we've got some vacancies which are not fully covered as well. So it's just to it won't necessarily be, unfortunately, the full 10% reduction on our employee costs.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions on headcount matters? No. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Steve. A really quick question on agency workers. Yeah, did the agents? I guess an agency worker probably costs about 30% or more relative to a sort of in-house and full-time employee. So do the departments of the council sort of undertake exercises to ask the question, out of our dozens, or I can't remember how many agency staff it is, but it's quite a very significant number. Our exercises taken every year, sort of each department asks a question, is there something we can do to make these agency workers, given full-time employment, bring them into to the council for the longer term, give them job security and everything, but that will have the added benefit of reducing the cost quite considerably, I guess, once they're in-house, as opposed to having to go outside for agency workers.
So there are some agency staff which cost the same as our permanent staff, and then there are those which will be significantly more, which can be lawyers, accountants, and some social care staff. So yes, and the regular reporting that we have to standards in GP, there's regular meetings every month at DMTs to review agency staff, the need and the cost of them. And we do have quite a good temp to perm process as well. So we do regular what we call temp to perm, so where we encourage our temporary staff, if they were recruited in a competitive process, bring them onto our books. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that probably ends the review of the monitoring report. Thank you very much, Caroline, for answering all our questions, and thank you also, David. I think we move on now to the apprenticeship levy report, please. Is someone going to introduce that, please?
So apologies, Chair. I may have not let Barbara know that she was probably meant to attend.
Oh, okay.
So apologies. So therefore, I'll introduce it if that's okay. So there was a query. We had some questions at the last financial monitoring task group, and then there was the request for the paper. So this has been pulled together, hopefully to address those issues and concerns, and shows the progress we're making in some areas, and sort of the approach we're taking to what we call level entry apprenticeships. So new staff joining the council, as well as then those staff that are already in, trying to help them with their career development. So therefore that will be higher level apprenticeship areas. There's clearly new courses coming on stream, but it did take an awful long time for social care to create courses that were then eligible for the apprentice levy. So we are trying to maximise the use of that now within children's and adult social care. But happy to take any questions that I hopefully will be able to answer, Chair.
Right. Well, colleagues, over to you. I, in fact, have a question, so maybe we'll start off with that. It seems to me there's a backlog of apprenticeship funds that may expire, because I'm looking at page 90, and we seem to have contributions being paid in rising each year. So at the end of 2019-20, I think we've got almost 2 million in the 3 years paid in. We've only spent about 500,000 and expired's about 72,000. So it looks like we've got a tidal wave of expired funds about to, as it were, not materialise. Is that the case?
I wouldn't call it a tidal wave. We are only able to use the apprentice levy, so which is levied on all of the pay bill of the council and our schools who come through our payroll service, to fund training. So as I said, there are certain training in areas where we haven't been able to find the courses. The courses haven't been available to us to actually put our staff through them. So there has been still other training that we have provided to our staff, which we haven't been able to charge against the levy. However, there's been significant work being done by Barbara and her team to identify further opportunities for staff to maximise the levy where we can. And indeed, she's referenced in the report, currently out to tender for a whole suite of apprentice levy training, because what would happen is someone would identify a training course, then we'd look to see, well, no, you can't do that one. Let's maximise the use of the levy, go on this one, and then have to do a mini tender. And that happened, I think, when we were looking to do some of our accounting trainees. So that should help address that. But we are not alone in our ability to maximise the use of this levy. So you have 2 years before you use it. And indeed, when it was first introduced, it was called an apprentice tax rather than an apprentice levy, because the fear was that we would not be able to spend it, and it's just a way of the government getting additional income.
Okay, I think I understand that. Simon, do you have a question?
Yes, my question's about the reference on page 5 to third-party contractors and sharing our use of the levy. And I wondered why we haven't done this already. My understanding is, I was talking to somebody today at London Boroughs, that some other boroughs are already doing this, so it does have some difficulties, but apparently it's going to get easier. And it's not only our contractors that we can use it for, we can actually use it for other organisations within the borough. So it seems that rather than wasting some of this money, i.e., handing it over to the government and not being able to use it, we could actually be using it, but we just haven't been using it so far. Is that a fair understanding?
So that's normally taken forward by the Future Merton team. So we need to see how we can take that further. And indeed, I think COVID has impacted on that, and especially with our local businesses struggling generally. So to then say, oh, come on, let's see if we can fund some training, may not be the type of support they want from us at this stage, but that's certainly something we can raise with the Future Merton team.
Great, thank you.
Peter, then Simon, please. Sorry, Peter, then Paul, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We've got a target of 96 apprentices or places per annum. And if I look at the actual numbers, the starts on page 90, we're running at less than half that. 164 starts as against, what would that be, 384 if we were to hit target. I'm interested to know about supply versus demand. I mean, is there actually sufficient demand to fill those 96 places, or is it in fact a struggle to find people to start on the courses?
So I'm just trying to see where the 96 is from.
Okay. Yes, para 2.8, target for Merton Council is 96 new starts per annum.
All right. So I think it's a combination of both. So where we have people who might be able to go on an apprentice course, they don't necessarily want the course that the levy will fund. So we do have some challenges there. And then it's finding how people, if it's an entry-level apprentice, finding the monies to pay for the entry-level apprentices. And I think so we are trying to explore more ways of getting that. So certainly some of these higher level courses are longer than a year. So some are 3 years. So just because we're maybe slow in getting a recruit in 1 year, if we've got them and they're there for 3 years, that can help offset that.
Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you, Stephen. There does seem to be some activity now. Some of it feels a bit late in the day, but perhaps that's unfair. I just want to check a few things, but these might be detailed questions you can't answer, Caroline. At 2.37, it says we're retendering, our apprenticeship training provider contracts. Is that re-tendering or tendering for the first time, or are we re-tendering all of them, or are we doing more than we were?
Probably a bit of everything. So I don't think, as I said, we hadn't necessarily gone out full scale. We were going out sort of on a piecemeal basis. But what we're now looking to do is have something overall that people can then call off, rather than come to us and say, oh, I would now, it's been identified, I would like to do this training. And then we'd have to go and do a mini tender exercise. So that should make it quicker for people to be able to access their learning and development.
And I'd like your thoughts on 2.17 and 2.18. Presumably apprenticeships, sort of entry-level apprenticeships are exempt from the minimum wage legislation because there's a large amount of training going on. It's not just all employed work. Now, one of the reasons, one of the points you have inferred today is, of course, remember, the levy doesn't pay for wages. Are we right in our policy of paying the London living wage to entry-level apprentices, or is it a cruel kindness and stopping us doing all the entry-level apprentices we should be doing because we're not taking advantage of the fact this isn't a fully waged job?
Some of the jobs that our apprentices do, I would say, are quite valued.
I'm sure they are, but it's
therefore it does seem a bit, I would say, unfair to not pay that wage to them. So I don't think we're doing them a disservice.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
But presumably the logic of the legislation is that because these people are getting a lot of training and not all of it is productive work, the way an employer can afford to have as many apprentices as they should have is to pay them slightly less. But you don't think that's a problem for us? You think we should always pay the London living wage, even to entry-level apprenticeships?
I'm just trying to think how many that we had at the time when we looked to do that. So the majority of our apprentices are not entry level. So there are fewer at that level for which we would then pay the London living wage. So I don't see that as the barrier for, because I think that the marginal cost difference was not that significant.
Okay, although we part of what prompted my question was the fact to give our youth opportunities. It was those who were entry level. I think we should particularly be looking at it for. All I'd asked is that can that point at least be considered, and if it is an issue, have we thought through what it means? Lastly, on 2.42, there's this bizarre stuff about having a job for the apprentices once they've completed the apprenticeship. I always assumed we would craft apprenticeships by reference to our needs going forward. Is that not what we do, rather than just craft apprenticeships willy-nilly? And therefore, there'd almost by definition be a need going forward. There'd always be a job waiting for these people at the end of their fixed term apprenticeships. Do we have that sort of joined up way of thinking when we do it?
It's not as simple as that. Because for example, an entry-level apprentice, we will train people, say for example, on our IT division, so technology, but then once they finish their training and come to the end of their apprenticeship, there may not be a vacancy for them to go into, or they may apply for a role and they may not get it, or they may not finish their apprenticeship. So we have had some apprentices who've not qualified of the training side of things, or they've then just sort of almost taken too long and don't appear to be wanting to finish their coursework side of things. So clearly we have had some apprentices who have got permanent jobs with us, but it isn't always the case, and we can't necessarily promise a job at the end of that apprenticeship.
Thank you.
Okay. On the assumption that there are no other questions on apprenticeships, thank you, Caroline, for standing in for Barbara.
Well, apologies that I didn't let Barbara know.
Never mind. Final item for this evening, please, is a discussion of what we should consider at our July meeting on the 20th of July. At the moment, the only matter we're considering will be the monitoring report. I'm wondering if people have ideas about what they might, in addition, like to do a deep dive of. Paul.
I'm far more worried about the DSG than I was a month ago. A month ago, if you remember Ed as well, Ed, you were quite relaxed about the DSG and thought we could just account for this and it will all be solved by central government. Now, I'm really concerned because up until today, I thought all councils were sharing the pain similarly. I see what Karen has now said. I'm therefore far less confident that the government will come, like the cavalry to our rescue. And therefore, I really think we should look at this report that was prepared for cabinet and proceed as Ed suggested, because this is a real worry otherwise, I think. Okay.
Peter.
Yes, I mean, to use an overworked phrase, I do think the DSG is an existential threat, isn't it, to us? And there's already a lot of information here, actually, that I'm not sure how much more there is to be drawn out, but it might be useful to see it all together. And I suppose in my mind, I'm very interested in why should Merton be different? Do we have different parents who are more prone to argue that their child needs them?
That is a view of the DfE, that we have pushy parents.
Well, we probably do, don't we? And the fact that it's growing, that 10% plus per annum, all of these, whether we can glean much from comparing with other neighbour boroughs, I mean, that might be one way of looking at it, and see if we can isolate the particular causal variables that are leading to our higher than average deficit. It certainly is very, very worrying and really overshadows everything else, doesn't it?
Nigel?
Thank you, Chair. I was also thinking by next no, June, July, whenever we would hope be actual not down, and now it's time to try to get the merchant back on track, help the business, and also people's employment, which is vital. Is it possible to set up, which I don't know if it's been heard of, but sort of like in a cater in terms of recovery, how much has merchant recovered, but I think it'll be over 3 years some period, maybe a year, don't know. Just a thought.
Okay, so some kind of summation about where we are at the end of the year and how we recover from the impact of COVID to date. Okay, that makes sense. Did I see another hand go up and then go down? Was that you, Peter? Oh, it's Paul. Okay. So I think where we've got to is a clear desire to understand a bit more about the DSG. Now, remember, Caroline, earlier you said that you and Hannah were looking into this, and you weren't quite sure whether you would have been able to explore all the aspects of this in time for a July meeting. Nonetheless, I just wonder whether it's worth, as it were, scheduling an update. You know, maybe you won't have the full answer come July, but you might have some ideas that can be shared with us. And obviously there's a number of papers that can be republished to make us better informed.
Well, certainly, Chair, and also hopefully by then we will have our new Director of Children's Schools and Families, because ideally it should be them leading on this paper for you. And sort of we've been sort of supporting and helping to drive, but they should be presenting. So that's something also we need to follow up on. But they can certainly bring an update, even if we haven't got all the information for you.
Okay. And as that's obviously going to be primarily done in the Children's Schools and Families Directorate, do you think it would also be possible to produce a kind of summary or plan for the recovery that now Councillor Bembo was requesting?
Well, unfortunately, at the moment, that our plan for recovery is what you've seen. That's we haven't got any detail yet as to how we're bringing that deficit down.
But potentially by July we might have an update. I'm
hoping by July we'll have this. This is what we're saying at the moment is the worst case scenario.
Sorry to press you, but do I take that as a yes or no?
Well, I'm hoping by the time we bring an update to you, it will be an improved position. But whether it's a deficit recovery plan, that's, I think, be quite an ask for July.
Okay, fair enough. Peter and then Nigel again.
Yes, thank you. I think it'd be really interesting if we could hear from some of the staff who are on the front line in dealing with appeals on the HCPs, their views on what's driving the demand. So obviously, pushy parent is a very easily grasped hypothesis, but it would, if we could get, I admit it would be qualitative, but to just get a little more under the skin of what's driving the demand.
Okay, I think that's a request that we need to put to the new Director of Children's Services, isn't it? I mean, I can see where you're coming from, and I think that may be very useful. So I think we should request that, you know, via the minutes. Rosie can make the request to the new director to see if that's appropriate for July. Okay, Nigel.
Yes, I was thinking, I think sort of the same question as Peter, but it's really about what are the it's not just the front line staff, but also the staff at the council. What have they learned from the you know, the code of it, and are there lessons can be learned in the long term? Thank you.
Okay, Nigel, thank you. So we have a number of suggestions here. I think we're perhaps in danger now of overloading the July meeting. I think that what we ought to be doing is looking at the dedicated schools grant, is having an update of that, because I think we all have common concerns about that. I think the idea of having some of our frontline officers giving us insights is a good idea, but I think that's kind of subject to the agreement of the new Director of Children and Schools. I think the other point now about the recovery plan, the COVID lessons learnt, by that I take it, Nigel, you mean financial lessons or the financial impact of lessons learned. I think maybe this is an action for myself as chair with Caroline after the meeting to better understand what is going to be produced for other scrutiny panels and indeed for Cabinet, and what should also come to us. Does that seem a fair roundup of where we've got to? I see some nods. Thank you. I think we'll take that as the agreed way forward. So thank you for that. Any other final comments on any other matters by any members present? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attendance this evening. I'm aware that a number of officers have been in attendance all evening and haven't spoken. I do appreciate you making the effort to attend. You might have been called on, but alas, were not. But thank you for attending. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for David for speaking to us. Thank you, and it's my pleasure to declare the meeting closed.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.